Is your protagonist suffering enough? If you're anything like most writers, the answer is no, and that's a problem for your story. Above all else, readers respond to underdogs. If your character is not suffering enough in the story, there's no way for the reader to see them as an underdog, and therefore there's no way for the reader to attach sympathy or empathy or excitement towards following their actions. Without facing meaningful struggle or adversity, characters will feel flat and boring on the page, and your story will feel lifeless and limp as a result. As Robert McKee says in Story, true character is revealed by the choices a person makes under pressure. The greater the pressure, the greater the depth of true character that is revealed. Without giving your protagonist enough struggle or adversity or conflict to face in the story, you're robbing them of an opportunity to expose their true self to readers and to you as the author. It's only by pushing your characters to the utter brink of their capacity, and maybe even further beyond that, that you can really expose their true nature and really create a story that readers are enthralled by. You have to make your characters suffer if you want to produce a great story, because it's the characters that face the most adversity, the most hardship, the most suffering. Those are the characters that endure forever. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through my 5-step process for giving your character more suffering throughout your story. It's a bit of a weird way to put it, but essentially this is a process that you can use, and you can use all aspects of this process in pretty much every story while still having tons of room for your own originality and creativity on these ideas. But following this 5-step process will ensure that your character is facing meaningful struggles, and it's going to make sure that your character is being put in those positions where they're having to make those choices under immense pressure, thus revealing their true character and gaining a lot of empathy and connection with your readers. Step number 1 is to progressively increase the power gap between your protagonist and your antagonist. So some really quick storytelling terms here. Protagonist is a main character, someone who is driving the story, and an antagonist is the main force of opposition. So the antagonist could be another character, or it could be the environment, such as in The Martian, where Mars, the planet, is trying to kill Mark Watney, the astronaut, or it could even be the internal demons within your main character themselves. What's important here is that the antagonist should be the driver of your protagonist's suffering. The antagonist's goals and their attempt to pursue their own desires should be the thing that is forcing your character into adversity, the thing that is making their life hard. And your protagonist is only going to be compelling and interesting to the extent that your antagonist is well crafted. Stories without a strong antagonist, without an interesting antagonist, fail as a narrative. Stories with an immensely powerful antagonist, one who is as cunning and as devious, maybe even more cunning and devious than the protagonist, impress and excite us as an audience. This is why The Dark Knight, and specifically the Joker in that film, is such a good narrative, because the Joker is more smart than Batman. He is more well prepared than Batman, and he's willing to do things that are crazier than Batman is. And because he is more powerful in this sense, it creates so much more stakes and tension for us as an audience. And for me personally, I think it's a really good idea to make sure that your antagonist begins the story as being more powerful than your protagonist. So even if your protagonist is like the ruler of a country, you can probably still find a way to develop an antagonist that is more powerful than them, and therefore there are more stakes. Because the problem is if you have a bunch of little antagonists who are less powerful than the main character, then there's no tension. There's no real sense of conflict. The character is not going to be under that pressure that forces them into difficult decisions. If, on the other hand, you have a really powerful antagonist, and the antagonist's power in comparison to the protagonist's power increases throughout the story, tension will continue to be ramped up progressively. And that leads me to step number 2, which is to remove your main character's allies, powers, and weapons. Ideally, you want your main character entering the climax of the story at their most helpless. You don't want them entering the climax with the most amount of weapons that they've had, or the most amount of allies, or the most amount of power. You only want to do that if you have progressively given the antagonist even more allies and weapons and power throughout the story. Ideally, you want the main character being at the mercy of the villain at the end of your story in their most vulnerable and weak state as possible. So as you get towards that climax, ask yourself, how can I strip away the things that are helping the main character in my story to make it more difficult for them to conquer the antagonist? And again, remember, the antagonist does not have to be another person. It could be a society, it could be a world, or it could be the inner demons within a character themselves. The third step is to make sure that you are only letting coincidences work against your main character. I read a book recently from one of my story coaching clients where there were a lot of coincidences that really helped the main character, that allowed them to get into places where they probably shouldn't have been able to access quite easily, or allowed them to succeed in their goals in a relatively straightforward manner. And that kind of ruined a lot of the tension for the story. On the other hand, it would have been far more interesting if the coincidences worked against the main character. So, they're sneaking into a place and they think they're getting in, they've got a good plan, but then because of a strange coincidence, there happens to be a guard who's patrolling at an irregular time. Now you've used that coincidence to set back the main character. And when you adopt this approach of not giving your character easy wins, but making everything difficult for them, it's so much more suspenseful for readers and the stakes just feel like they're that much higher. On a similar note, this leads to step number 4, which is to turn successes into failures, also known as the yes, but approach. So yes, but is kind of like a improv storytelling thing. And essentially it's saying, you succeed with the character doing this one thing, so that's a yes, but it leads to this other thing. So for example, let's say I'm writing a fantasy story and my character is getting attacked by this demonic knight, and my character manages to slay this knight and survive. Yes, that is the yes component of the yes but they accidentally touch the knight's sword after they've killed the knight, and now this sword begins to corrupt them and they can't get rid of it. So you have the yes of defeating this foe, but then you are followed by the but of it leads to this extra complication. So the idea here is that you want to be stacking these progressive complications throughout your story and continually making the buts worse and worse and worse as you build up and accelerate throughout your narrative. So take every time your character achieves something or gains a bit of success and ask yourself, how could this actually be the worst possible thing for them? How could I turn this success into a failure to continue stacking the odds against my main character? And then lastly, step number 5, which is probably the most important one, is to align your protagonist's suffering with your story's theme. So it's not enough to just have, random things happen to your character to set them back. That can be useful to a point, but the most truly impactful suffering and the most interesting exploration of tension and conflict in your story is going to happen when you are aligning it along the theme of your writing. As Steven Pressfield says, their ordeal has to be focused. It must resonate with the story's theme. And if the suffering must be on theme, then the more profound and universal the theme, the greater the emotional impact on the reader. So if you take a book like The Great Gatsby, for example, one of my all-time favorites, probably read it 6 or 7 times. In this story, you have Gatsby who builds himself up from nothing to become an extremely wealthy figure, all to pursue the girl of his desires. However, she is already married to Tom Buchanan, and despite his efforts to try to entice her away from Tom and into his life, she refuses. And this leads to this tragic downfall within Gatsby. What makes Gatsby's suffering so resonant, and what has made this book, continue to endure for almost 100 years after its publication? I think it came out in 1925, is the fact that Gatsby's struggle and his suffering here really aligns with this story's theme, in the sense that the story is all about exploring the allure and the destruction and the lie of the American dream. This idea that anyone can come and build themselves up by their bootstraps, build themselves into a self-made man. Gatsby believes in that dream wholeheartedly, and he thinks that by acting out on that dream, he will be able to gain this girl of his desires. However, he's unable to do it because he comes from new money. He does not come from the entrenched, kind of old money of which Tom Buchanan is stock. And that eventually leads to Daisy choosing Tom over Gatsby. Quoting from Steven Pressfield again, "What makes Gatsby's downfall so resonant is that Gatsby's suffering is so American. His dream is the American dream. You've believed it, I've believed it, we've all operated under its spell our whole lives." And because that theme is so resonant and universal, this idea of striving towards these dreams, striving to recreate the past in Gatsby's case as well, when Gatsby is unable to achieve this dream, that suffering aligns with the theme in a way that makes it so much more resonant and profound and impactful for us as readers. Now, ensuring that your character has a strong amount of suffering and conflict to face in the story is a very pivotal part of developing a compelling character. But if you would like to hear some more thoughts on how to create interesting, complex characters, then you might enjoy this video I made analyzing Daemon Targaryen from House of the Dragon.